Miss Clara Redwynd fled to Greystone Hall to escape her past. But within its shadowed halls, she finds a grieving child, a guarded widower, and secrets far darker than her own. The Governess of Greystone Hall, a Gothic romance of buried truths and forbidden longing, begins now. Chapter 1. Greystone Hall, Cornwall, March 1816. Arrival at Greystone Hall. The road to Greystone Hall twisted like a serpent through the Cornish cliffs, each turn shadowed by leafless oaks and banks of wet stone. Miss Clara Redwynd sat straight-backed in the worn chaise, her gloved hands folded atop a small leather reticule. Outside, the late afternoon fog blurred the world into a watercolour of grey and green. The horses' hooves splashed through icy puddles, and above the tangled trees, the sea's distant roar whispered through the branches. She'd travelled nearly 2 days to reach this place, from the thick soot of London's alleys to this strange, salt-laced silence. She had seen grand houses before, homes filled with candle-lit staircases and operatic scandals, but Greystone Hall was something else entirely. It was said to be haunted, though that word no longer stirred Clara as it once had. She pressed her lips together, eyes narrowing as the road widened and the iron gates came into view. The coach shuddered to a stop. Beyond the gates, Greystone Hall loomed like an accusation. Its grey stone facade was streaked black with age and sea wind. Its towers clawed at the low-hanging sky. Brambles bristled along the walls, and dead ivy clung to the north wing like veins. The front windows reflected nothing, not sky nor visitor, as if the house refused to acknowledge the world beyond itself. The coachman, a red-faced man in a fraying cap, descended and moved to her door. "This is it, miss," he said. "Not a place I choose to winter in." Clara gave a faint smile, the expression barely touching her eyes. "Neither would I, Mr. Keene. Yet here we are." He handed down her modest trunk and glanced once at the looming house. "You mind yourself in there. They say the last governess only lasted a fortnight." Clara lifted an eyebrow. "Do they?" "Aye. Took to her nerves, they said. Wandered off in the rain. Never came back. Perhaps she found another post." "Or the cliffs found her," he murmured. He gave a hasty tip of the cap and climbed back into the chaise. Clara turned toward the house, the wind catching at her cloak. She took one deep breath, then moved forward. The wind whipped around her, lifting the hem of her travelling cloak and teasing at the edges of her bonnet. Her hair, chestnut brown, thick and pinned in smooth coils, gleamed despite the fog. She was striking, in a way that unsettled more than it pleased. High cheekbones, a delicate jaw, a straight nose, and wide, intelligent eyes of soft hazel flecked with green. Her skin bore the pale luminosity of winter roses. She moved with elegance, but not fragility, every step deliberate, every glance watchful. Not a naive beauty, but one sharpened by grief and grace. It was shaped by loss, refined by discipline. Mrs. Hodge met her at the threshold like a scowling gargoyle come to life. "Miss Redwynd, I presume?" Clara inclined her head, suppressing her amusement at the woman's dramatic keyring and storm-weathered expression. "Indeed." The housekeeper turned without another word, her heels clacking against the stone as she led Clara through the main doors and into Greystone Hall. The air inside was cold and smelled faintly of damp stone, old paper, and orange peel. The entrance hall was a cavern of dark panelling, with twin staircases curling upward like wary serpents. A faded Aubusson rug stretched toward a pair of closed double doors, and overhead, a crystal chandelier hung draped in shadow, its prisms dulled by years of soot. "Mind your steps," Mrs. Hodge said, as she lit a single wall sconce. "This wing's not used much anymore. You'll find no luxury here." "I require none," Clara said, her tone mild. "I am not a guest." "No, you're not." Clara kept silent after that. She had learned long ago that silence often unsettled those who wielded power carelessly. The governess's quarters were small but surprisingly warm. A fire had been lit, casting gold over the narrow bed, the wash basin, and the writing desk, tucked beneath a frost-rimmed window. Clara paused to take it in, grateful in spite of herself. From the window she could see the sea, a grey strip in the distance, restless and ever-moving. "Lessons begin at 7, Mrs. Hodge said. "The child takes her breakfast in the nursery. You may eat afterward." Clara turned, surprised. "She dines alone." "She prefers it. Most children take breakfast with their governess." Mrs. Hodge's expression did not shift. "The child does not speak, and has not since Lady Ashley passed." A pause. "She will eat in silence. You will join her when she's ready for lessons." The way she said past made Clara's skin prickle. She's to be taught letters, piano, French, history, nothing else. "And affection?" Mrs. Hodge's expression turned sharp. "I said nothing else." She left Clara then, her keys rattling down the corridor. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sentient. On the desk sat a folded letter, sealed in blue wax. Clara unfastened her gloves, laid them beside her inkstand, and broke the seal. "Miss Redwynd, you have been appointed governess to my daughter, Lilibet Ashley. I expect you to observe the rules of this household. Your position is instructional, not familial, emotional, or spiritual. Do not confuse kindness with indulgence. She is not to be coddled. You will present yourself in the library at 8:30 this evening. Sir Tristan Ashley." Clara stared at the paper a moment longer, then folded it and placed it neatly in her valise. At exactly 8:25, Clara knocked on the library door. "Enter." His voice was smooth and cold, with the kind of authority that needed no volume. She stepped inside. The library was vast and lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, a pair of high windows on the far wall revealing nothing but black night. A fire burned low in the hearth, its light casting golden shadows over polished mahogany and deep emerald carpets. Sir Tristan stood near the fire, one hand resting on the mantel. And he was, without question, one of the most devastatingly handsome men Clara had ever seen. Dark hair swept back from his brow, slightly unruly, yet deliberate. Eyes of crystalline blue, cool and unreadable. His features were aristocratic and clean. A perfectly cut jaw, sculpted lips, and a gaze that seemed to look through a person rather than at them. He wore a simple black evening coat over a grey waistcoat, a white cravat tied without flourish. His presence filled the room. He did not smile. "Miss Redwynd, Sir Tristan, you received my note." "I did." "And you are still here." She lifted a brow. "Was that in question?" He regarded her for a long moment. "You've been recommended for your intelligence and discretion, two qualities that I value above all others. I am grateful for the opportunity." "My daughter," he said, folding his arms, "does not speak. She has not spoken in more than a year. I do not expect miracles from you. I expect structure." Clara nodded. "Structure I can provide." "She does not need affection," he continued, "nor music that makes her linger in the past, not lullabies, not sorrow dressed as song. She needs order." "My daughter may study music as a discipline," he said tightly. "But not that music, not her mother's." "I see." He studied her carefully. "Do you?" "I've worked with children who grieve, Sir Tristan. They do not always grieve quietly." His jaw clenched slightly. "You may go." She curtsied, perfectly. As she reached the door, he spoke again. "One more thing." She turned. "You are not to enter the West Wing." She held his gaze. "Of course." She left without another word and went to her room. Clara exhaled slowly, then folded the letter in two and placed it beneath the inkwell. So he is as cold as they say. She ventured down to dinner later than she should have. The servants' hall was empty by the time she arrived, but a plate had been set aside: cold roast chicken, steamed carrots, and a buttered roll. Clara ate slowly, in silence, the fire crackling behind her. As she lifted the teacup to her lips, a sound reached her ears, a soft, high voice singing. Clara paused. The voice was coming from above. She rose and followed the sound to a narrow stair, then up, past the nursery door, and down a gallery lined with windows. The song had no words, only melody, eerie and beautiful. She turned the corner and found nothing. Only a long hallway ending in a window where a girl stood, small, slender, motionless. Lilibet. Clara took one slow step forward. "Miss Lilibet." The child turned her head but did not speak. Her hair was pale gold, and her nightdress trailed like mist around her bare feet. Her eyes were grey, not cold, but watchful. Old somehow. Clara smiled gently. "I'm Miss Redwynd. I've come to be your governess." No response. Then, so faint Clara wasn't sure she'd heard it at all, the child whispered, "It listens," then turned and slipped through the door behind her. Clara stared after her, a chill racing down her spine. That night, Clara stood at her window looking out across the cliffs. Far below, the sea clawed at the rocks with restless fury, white-capped and furious. Wind moaned through the stones of the house like a living thing. The bedroom was quiet, too quiet. Then, a sound. Just one. A single piano note, faint, hollow, rising from somewhere below. Clara crossed to the door and opened it. The corridor was dark, the candle sconces unlit. From far down the hall she saw a flicker of white. A nightgown? A figure? She stepped out, but the corridor was empty. Only silence, only the house, watching. Chapter 2. The Silent Child. Clara woke to the sound of birdsong. It was faint, hesitant. A single lark outside the frost-laced window, singing in defiance of winter. She sat up slowly, brushing hair from her eyes, and took a moment to orient herself. The fire in the grate had burned low. The room smelled faintly of lavender and soot. Her breath curled in the cold morning air. She rose, washed quickly, and dressed in her second-best gown, a warm cinnamon-brown wool trimmed with a modest ivory collar. She coiled her chestnut hair into a neat knot and fastened it with her mother's silver comb, the one item she'd brought with her that held no purpose but comfort. She paused a moment by the mirror. Today, she thought, I begin. The nursery suite was quiet. It occupied the eastern wing of Greystone Hall, far from the main staircase, accessible only through a narrowing corridor that seemed forgotten by the rest of the house. Clara walked it in silence, the weight of history pressing in from the cold stone walls around her. The schoolroom was simple. A child's desk and chair beside the fire, a small pianoforte tucked against the far wall, bookshelves lined with untouched spellers and readers. A vase of withered flowers sat on the windowsill. Someone, perhaps a previous governess, had once tried to brighten the space. No one had thought to replace them. Breakfast had been set out on a tray, a boiled egg, toast with orange marmalade, and a cup of tea. Too milky for Clara's taste. She left it untouched. She moved quietly through the room, wiping a layer of dust from the windowsill and warming her hands before the fire. Then she heard it. Soft footsteps outside the door. Clara turned. Lilibet Ashley stood in the doorway. She looked like a child out of time, small, silent, self-possessed. Her pale blonde hair fell in loose waves down her back, the ends catching the firelight. Her face was too still for a girl of 8, almost unnaturally so. She was dressed in navy wool with a scalloped white collar and ribboned cuffs. Her hands were clasped before her like a little statue. Clara smiled. "Good morning, Miss Lilibet." No answer, not even a blink. The girl simply watched her. Clara's smile softened. "Would you like to come in?" A long pause. Then Lilibet stepped across the threshold. Clara gestured toward the smaller chair. "This is your place, if you like." The girl sat without hesitation, her spine straight, her feet just barely touching the floor. She didn't fidget or squirm like most children. She seemed to melt into stillness, becoming part of the quiet room. "I thought we might start with reading," Clara said, gently placing a primer on the desk. Lilibet didn't move. Clara waited, and waited. Then, with the slow patience of a woman used to watching for things that don't wish to be seen, she drew the primer back. "Or not," she said. "We could try something else." She stood, crossed to the pianoforte, and lifted the lid. Music, she had often found, spoke more than language, especially in houses where people refused to say what they meant. She pressed a few soft notes, C major, simple and warm. Lilibet turned her head. Clara looked back. "Would you like to play?" Another long pause. Then, surprisingly, the girl stood. She crossed the room in utter silence and sat at the piano, placed her hands on the keys, and played. The melody was unlike anything Clara had expected. It was slow and strange, a minor key piece, woven with mournful, searching chords. It sounded like something one might hum in a fever dream, or hear in a cathedral long ruined by time. The notes were soft but sure, each one carefully chosen. Clara didn't speak. She barely breathed. When it ended, Lilibet rested her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead. Clara stepped closer. "That was beautiful." No reply. Then Lilibet stood, returned to her desk, and picked up the chalk from the slate beside it. She wrote carefully, "My mother's song." Clara swallowed. "Your mother taught you to play." The child said nothing, only erased the words and wrote again. She sang in the night. Then below, she drew a small figure, a woman in a long dress, her face obscured by scribbled lines. A veil. Clara stared at it for a long moment, then gently took the slate and wiped it clean. Sir Tristan arrived just before noon. His footsteps were unmistakable, calm, clipped, assured. He entered the schoolroom in a storm grey coat, his posture rigid, his blue eyes sweeping the space before he spoke. Clara stood. Lilibet, seated at her desk, did not move. "She's attending?" he asked. "She is," Clara replied evenly. "Is she speaking?" "Not aloud, but she's expressing herself." "How?" Clara gestured to the slate. He stepped forward and read the words his daughter had written. His eyes flicked to Clara, unreadable. "She played," Clara added, "on the piano." "I heard it," he said, his voice tightening, "down the corridor. Just one phrase, and it was enough. She's not to play that music. She played before I knew what it was." Tristan turned his gaze on the girl. "Lilibet." She didn't look at him. "She understands perfectly well," he said. Clara stepped in. "She's grieving." "She's indulging," he snapped. "She knows the rules." "And she's a child," Clara replied, calm but firm. Silence fell like a curtain. Tristan drew himself up, No more music, no more of that song. She says it was her mother's. He didn't answer. He only looked again at the slate. Then he turned to leave. At the door, he stopped. I've no patience for softness, Miss Redwynd. Clara inclined her head. Then you may want to avoid the nursery. He turned at that, just enough to meet her eyes. His expression gave nothing away. You may find, he said quietly, that some rooms are quiet for a reason. Then he left, the door clicking shut behind him. Then he was gone, the door closing with quiet finality. The rest of the day passed in strange quiet. Lilibet did not eat her luncheon but sat at the desk, drawing, delicate lines of waves, windows and roses. She was not unresponsive, simply contained, like a lidded candle. Clara introduced simple French phrases. The girl did not repeat them, but she copied them, flawlessly, in her notebook. And once, when Clara touched her shoulder to offer a correction, Lilibet flinched. The moment passed quickly, but Clara did not forget it. That evening, Clara dined alone in her room. The fire had been lit. A tray awaited her on the desk. Roast partridge with herb butter, soft potatoes, and a blood orange tart. It was unexpectedly elegant. And it made Clara suspect the household had once operated in a higher state of glory. After eating, she opened her journal and wrote, Lilibet is like a ship lost in fog, drifting, waiting, but not drowning. Sir Tristan is harder to read. Grief has turned to granite in him. I do not yet know what lies beneath. But I believe he is afraid, not of me, of memory. A soft knock came at her door. Clara opened it. Lilibet stood there in her nightdress, barefoot, her hair loose around her shoulders, clutching a doll with button eyes and a fraying silk dress. She said nothing, but she held out her hand. Clara knelt. Would you like me to come with you? The girl nodded once. They walked the hall in silence. The nursery felt colder than it had that morning. The fire was nearly out. Clara checked the windows. Closed. The bed was turned down. The room was tidy. But the air had changed, close, unsettled, as though something unseen had just passed through. Lilibet climbed into bed and pulled the blankets up to her chin. Clara tucked the doll beside her. Lilibet reached for the slate on the nightstand and scribbled something quickly. Clara leaned closer. Someone at the window. Clara turned, pulse quickening. Outside, only darkness and wind. She asked softly. Lilibet hesitated, then erased the slate. After a moment, she drew instead, a faint figure by a window, hair flowing, face blank. Clara stared at the chalk outline. Did you dream of her? She asked. Lilibet didn't respond. She simply pulled the blanket over her shoulder and turned away. Later that night, Clara sat by her fire, unable to rest. The house was quiet, but not at peace. She heard it again. One single piano note, faint, low. Clara rose and crossed to the door. The corridor was empty, but far down the hall, a candle flickered, then vanished. Clara closed the door and turned slowly back toward the room. Greystone Hall was full of grief, but perhaps it was also full of voices, some still trying to speak. Chapter 3. A Dance of Shadows. The day was draped in mist. It hung thick around the cliffs, blurring the sea into a dull smear of pewter. Even the house seemed to retreat into itself, its windows dark, the chimneys coughing thin threads of smoke into the sky. Clara dressed with care. Today, she chose a gown of soft slate blue wool with braided trim at the cuffs. It was not fashionable, but dignified, respectable. The kind of dress that suggested restraint but allowed for quiet rebellion in the details. Her hair she swept up into a crown braid, pinned with her mother's silver comb. The fog lent her complexion a strange glow, like porcelain lit from within. Downstairs, breakfast was simple. Porridge with cream and brown sugar, poached pear with cinnamon, and strong tea served in a china cup cracked near the rim. Clara ate alone. Lilibet had not come to the nursery. Mrs. Hodge, tight-lipped, only said the child had been taken ill with a headache and would rest the morning. Clara didn't press. Instead, she wondered. It wasn't idleness, not exactly. More a kind of watchfulness, a desire to understand the bones of the house she had been asked to inhabit. Greystone Hall was a labyrinth. Corridors led nowhere. Staircases curved into shadow. Behind each door, some echo of the past waited. A chessboard half set, a painting draped in linen, the lingering scent of orange water and dust. The west wing was always colder, as though the walls themselves refused to remember warmth. That wing was forbidden, of course. Sir Tristan had said so on her first night. You are not to enter the west wing. Not in anger, but with something colder. A command shaped by grief. But today the door was open. Not wide, but ajar, enough to catch her eye as she passed, just a sliver of shadow and silence beyond. Clara hesitated. The corridor was empty. She stepped inside. The air was colder, yes, but it was something more. Thinner, maybe. Still, as though the rooms had not drawn breath in years. She moved slowly, the wooden floor creaking beneath her boots. On one wall, a mirror had cracked along its centre, the line bisecting her reflection into two uneven halves. Her hand lifted toward it, but before she could touch the glass, a voice broke the silence. You should not be in here. Clara turned. Sir Tristan stood behind her in the hall, dressed not in formal black, but in a dark green morning coat that brought unexpected colour to his severe frame. A black waistcoat. No cravat, only an open collar, as if he'd come from fencing practice or a walk in the fog. He didn't look angry, but his gaze was hard to meet. Clara stepped back into the corridor. The door was open, and that makes it yours to enter. It made it hard not to, she replied. A pause. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cruel either. More a flicker of recognition, a quiet challenge. You're not the first governess to disobey, he said. And yet, here I am, she said. He tilted his head slightly. Yes, still here. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Neither approval nor defiance, but something suspended in the middle. I wanted to understand the house, Clara said. It's difficult to teach a child when the rooms around her are full of locked doors. Tristan's smile faded. Some rooms are locked for a reason. Clara studied his face. He looked tired, but not in body, in soul, as though the very act of memory was wearing him down. I'm not here to pry, Sir Tristan. No, you're here to teach my daughter, and to protect her if I can. A longer pause. Tristan stepped forward. Come, he said. There's something I want to show you. He led her back through the hall, not speaking, until they reached the gallery that overlooked the east lawn. The fog outside had begun to thin, revealing rows of blackened hedges and frost-covered statuary. The gallery was narrow, lined with portraits in ornate frames. One of them had been removed, its space now empty, dustless. You removed her painting, Clara said. Yes. His voice was flat. I couldn't bear it. She glanced at him. He stood with his arms crossed, his eyes on the blank space where a woman once watched from behind glass. Lady Ashley? Yes. What was she like? He didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, She sang in Italian, spoke French, made everyone feel seen, even when she didn't see herself. Clara waited. "I failed her," he said. The words hung heavy in the air. Clara didn't contradict him. She simply stood beside him, her hands folded, offering presence instead of pity. "I've often found," she said after a moment, "that the ones we grieve most deeply are the ones we feel we didn't deserve." His voice was low. "And what ghosts do you carry, Miss Redwynd?" She answered without hesitation. "Ones I've long since stopped trying to outrun." Silence. Tristan turned away and walked a few steps toward the far window. "Grief," he said, "is a house with too many locked doors. You think you've sealed them all, but the wind finds its way in." Clara stepped closer. "And the West Wing?" "A door I prefer not to open." "And yet you left it ajar." He didn't reply. At luncheon, Clara dined with Mrs. Hodge and the undercook, Meg, an awkward but revealing affair. The table was set with boiled ham, pickled onions, a pale leek soup, and fresh bread still warm from the oven. A treacle tart followed, its crust golden and slightly burned. Meg, young and round-faced, watched Clara with something like admiration or curiosity. "You don't seem afraid of him," she said suddenly. "Sir Tristan?" Clara asked, buttering her bread. Meg nodded. "Most governesses were." Mrs. Hodge made a sharp sound. "Enough of that." But Meg persisted. "And the West Wing, did he tell you not to go?" "I'm not in the habit of disobeying orders," Clara said lightly. Meg laughed. "No, but you are in the habit of answering questions like a lady." Clara smiled. She didn't deny it. The afternoon passed slowly. Lilibet reappeared shortly before tea, pale but quiet. She didn't speak, but took her place at the schoolroom desk and began copying her French phrases without needing to be asked. It was only then Clara noticed her appearance. The girl wore a deep grey dress with a velvet collar, misfastened at the back. Her stockings were mismatched, one of them inside out. Her shoes were untied. Her hair hung in soft, uneven waves, half-brushed at best. A moment later, a maid arrived at the doorway, a girl of perhaps 16, flushed and breathless. "I'm sorry, miss," she whispered, wringing her hands. "She wasn't in her bed when I woke. I looked everywhere." Clara offered a quiet nod. "She's here now." The maid hesitated, her gaze flicking nervously to the child. "I thought I heard singing," she added, "just for a moment. But when I went toward it, the corridor was empty." Clara said nothing. The maid bobbed a quick curtsy and vanished down the hall. Clara turned back to Lilibet, who continued writing as though nothing had happened, as though she had always been there, always belonged to that desk, that silence. But the shadows felt longer now, and the room colder. That evening, the fog returned, thick as milk. The candles in the hallway burned low. Clara stood at her window for a long while, watching the waves blur into the horizon. Behind her, the fire crackled low. A piano note, faint as a breath, rose from the floor below. She didn't move toward it. Not yet. She simply listened. And somewhere in the hall beyond her door, footsteps passed, even though no one had said goodnight. Chapter 4. Threads of the Past. The fog did not lift for 3 days. It clung to the windows like breath, soft and constant, shrinking the world outside to a handful of shapes and sounds. Even the sea seemed muted, its roar dulled as though the cliffs had swallowed its voice. Inside Greystone Hall, the days folded in on themselves. Clara kept to her routine with deliberate care. She rose early each morning, dressing in quiet colours, dove grey wool, pale blue linen, once a russet skirt softened with age. She brushed her hair until it shone and pinned it neatly back, as if order in her appearance might impose order on her thoughts. The house did not resist her routine, but neither did it welcome it. Lilibet returned to her lessons, punctual and silent. She spoke no words, yet she communicated everything, through the careful formation of her letters, the way she aligned her books, the way she paused before beginning each task, as though listening for permission. Her French improved quickly. Her arithmetic was precise. Her drawings, however, had changed. At first they were small things, a horizon line drawn again and again, a cluster of dark birds above a blank sky, a house with too many windows. Then came the figure, always a woman, always veiled, always facing away. Sometimes she stood at the edge of the page, sometimes near the cliffs. Once she appeared in the corner of a garden, half hidden by hedges Clara recognized from the east lawn. Clara did not ask, not yet. She had learned, long ago, that questions could be more frightening than silence. The disturbances began quietly. A shawl missing from the back of her chair, later found folded at the foot of her bed. Her ink bottle shifted from the desk to the windowsill, the stopper loosened. One morning, she woke to find her boots neatly aligned by the door, cleaned, though she had left them muddy the night before. "Meg?" she asked casually at luncheon. The girl shook her head. "Didn't touch your room, miss. Mrs. Hodge says we're not to." Mrs. Hodge confirmed it, stiff-backed and suspicious. "I don't hold with servants wandering where they please." Clara thanked her and said no more. But that night, as she prepared for bed, she noticed the fire already burning, low and steady, though she had not rung. And on the hearth, laid carefully atop the stone, was a single white glove. It was not hers. The leather was soft, finely stitched, too delicate for warmth alone. She picked it up slowly. Inside the cuff, embroidered in pale thread, were the initials, EA. Clara's breath caught. She did not know why those letters unsettled her so deeply, but they did. They seemed to hum with recognition, like a name spoken in a dream. She placed the glove back on the hearth and did not sleep well. The letter arrived the next morning. It rested on her breakfast tray, folded with care, sealed in plain red wax. No crest, no return address, just paper, waiting. Clara stared at it for a long moment before breaking the seal. "Miss Redwynd, they may not know who you are, but I do. Do you think you can disappear into a cliffside manor and escape the past? Truth finds us all. A friend." The words were neat, controlled, almost kind, which frightened her more than cruelty would have. She folded the letter slowly and slid it into her apron pocket. Her porridge had gone cold. She left it untouched. All morning, she felt watched. Not in the dramatic sense. No footsteps behind her, no breath at her ear, but with the dull, persistent awareness that she was no longer invisible. Someone knew. Someone remembered. And memory, she knew too well, was never gentle. That afternoon, Clara noticed Lilibet watching her, not with curiosity, with concern. The child's grey eyes followed her movements, tracking the way Clara crossed the room, the way her hand lingered too long on the desk, the way she paused mid-sentence as though a thought had slipped away. During copywork, Lilibet drew again. This time the veiled woman stood near the cliffs. The sea was rendered with heavy strokes. The sky was blank. Behind the woman stood a second figure, smaller, faint, unfinished. Clara knelt beside her. "Lilibet," she said softly. "Who is she?" The child did not answer. Instead, she picked up her pencil and wrote beneath the drawing. "She waits." Clara felt a chill move through her, not fear exactly, but recognition. "She waits for whom?" she asked gently. Lilibet erased the slate. Later, walking the gallery alone, Clara thought she heard her name. It was faint, almost polite. She stopped. The corridor stretched empty before her. Portraits stared from the walls, their eyes dulled by age and varnish. She told herself it was the wind, but the wind did not know her name. That evening, she sat in her room with the letter open on her lap, reading it again and again as though repetition might change its meaning. She thought of London, of whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, of the decision that had sent her fleeing westward with only a reference and her mother's comb to her name. She had believed herself careful. She had believed herself safe. She was wrong. A soft knock came, not at the door, but at the window. Clara stood so quickly, her chair tipped backward. She crossed the room and pulled the drape aside. Nothing. Only fog, thick and luminous, pressed against the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, paler than usual, eyes too bright. When she turned, the fire had burned nearly to ash. She was certain she had fed it moments before. That night, she dreamed of footsteps in snow, of someone walking behind her, always just out of sight, of a woman's veil lifting in the wind, never enough to reveal her face. When Clara woke, her pillow was damp, her throat dry, and the glove was gone. The following morning, Sir Tristan stopped her in the corridor. "You look unwell," he said. "I'm quite all right." He studied her for a moment longer than necessary. "If something is troubling you, I will manage it," she said quickly. He nodded once, but his gaze lingered, sharp and assessing. As he walked away, Clara wondered, not for the first time, how much he already suspected, and whether Greystone Hall was merely holding its breath. Chapter 5. The Ballad of the Sea. The wind had changed. Clara noticed it in the early evening as she sat in the schoolroom correcting Lilibet's French exercises by firelight. The flames shivered in the grate, shadows stretching long against the stone hearth. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist, and the fog had finally begun to lift, reluctantly, like a curtain drawn from an old stage. Somewhere in the bones of the house, the air shifted. The hallways seemed quieter. Listening. Waiting. She set down her pen and rubbed at a spot of ink on her thumb. It was late. Lilibet had gone to bed hours ago, after a silent supper and a long pause beside the window, where she had watched the fog gather over the hedgerows, as if looking for someone in it. Before she left the schoolroom, Lilibet had handed Clara another drawing. This one was different. The veiled woman appeared again, but she was seated, her posture elegant, her fingers resting delicately on the keys of a piano. The room behind her was shadowed and indistinct, but a tall figure stood beside her. His face, like hers, was blank. Beneath it, in Lilibet's practiced hand, were 4 words. She played for him. Clara stared at it long after the girl had gone. The composition was too precise for a child her age. The perspective was correct. The lines were steady. Every fold of fabric, every shadow, had been drawn with a kind of watchful care that unsettled more than it impressed. The drawing stayed with her as she moved through the house. Not just the image, but the feeling it conjured. A memory, not her own. Something fragile. Something that hovered just at the edge of understanding. She did not return to her room. Not yet. She walked without reason, drawn by an unease she could not name. Her dress, deep plum wool, trimmed in black velvet at the cuffs, whispered softly with each step. Her slippers made no sound on the stone. The lamp she carried cast a small pool of golden light ahead of her, and nothing more. The silence of the house was not oppressive. It was expectant. She passed the library, the gallery, the grand staircase she rarely used, and then music. Soft, tentative, a melody unfolding in the dark. She followed it like a thread. It led her down a corridor she barely recognised, past shuttered drawing rooms and tall windows filmed with mist. She paused outside one narrow doorway, where the music was clearest. Slow, deliberate, drifting through the air like smoke. Inside, Sir Tristan sat at the piano. She didn't move. She stood just beyond the threshold, lamp in hand, watching him in silence. He had not dressed for company. His black waistcoat was unbuttoned at the collar. His sleeves were pushed back slightly, revealing pale wrists and long fingers moving over the keys with quiet precision. The room was warm. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting a flickering amber light against the velvet curtains and polished wood. The music was unfamiliar. Not a structured composition, no formal movement or flourish, but something personal. A series of slow, searching chords in a minor key. It had the shape of sorrow, but not its weight. The melody was spacious, like something remembered rather than written. Tristan played with his head slightly bowed, his whole body angled toward the keys. He was not performing. He was remembering. The intimacy of it made Clara's throat tighten. She should have stepped back, but she didn't. She let herself witness it, just for a moment longer. Then, without turning, he spoke. "You needn't hover in the shadows, Miss Redwynd." His voice was low, calm, not surprised. Clara paused just inside the doorway, her candle trembling slightly in its holder. "Forgive me. I did not mean to intrude." "You're not." He let the final note linger before lifting his hands from the keys. "I don't often play anymore," he said, "but sometimes it's the only way to remember her as she was." Clara set her candle on the side table and folded her hands. The piece, it was beautiful. "It doesn't have a name." He looked down. Eleanor never needed one. Clara took a tentative step closer. She played it often. Only when she was alone. A pause. Sometimes I would hear it in the night, always from down the hall. Never the full piece, just a fragment, a ghost of it. The word hung in the air. Ghost. But neither of them reached for it. Instead, Tristan shifted on the bench, leaving a space beside him. He didn't speak, but Clara sat, not close enough to touch, but near enough to feel the shared heat between them. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then Clara asked softly, "Do you play for yourself, or for her?" Tristan's eyes were fixed on the keys. "I'm not sure I know the difference anymore." He played again, just a few notes, the same opening motif Lilibet had once played. Clara recognised it now. Slow, minor, almost hesitant. "She plays it too," Clara said. "Lilibet." "I know. She doesn't speak, but she remembers sound, pattern, emotion." "She was too young," he said quietly. "She should not remember." Clara studied his profile. There was grief in it, yes, but not the raw kind. This was a grief worn down over time, etched deep, like sea-carved stone. He looked older in this light, not aged, but stripped bare. "Do you ever miss speaking of her?" she asked. He blinked slowly. "There's no one to speak to." "You could speak to me." That made him turn. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. "No one has said that to me in over a year." Clara looked away, flustered. "It's only, sometimes silence does more harm than honesty." "I've come to rely on silence," he said. "It keeps the wrong memories at bay." Clara's voice dropped to a murmur. "And the right ones. They come back in music, or in dreams." A pause. Then Tristan said, "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you come here?" His voice was careful. "You're not like the others." She knew he wasn't speaking about her teaching. "I needed to leave London," she said simply. "Why?" "There was a mistake, and someone important paid the price for it. I wasn't welcome anymore." "Did you love him?" Clara turned toward him. "No. I loved what he offered me. Safety, stability. But love? No. Not in the way that matters." "And you ran." "I survived." The word sat between them like a stone. Tristan looked at her for a long time. "We are not so different, Miss Redwynd." "No," she said. "I suppose we're not." He looked down at his hands, resting on the keys. Eleanor wasn't the woman they thought she was. They saw beauty, charm, a brilliant hostess, but she was restless, unwell perhaps, or simply unhappy. Clara said nothing. "She would disappear for hours," he continued. "Once for days. Once I found her on the cliffs, barefoot in the rain, humming to herself. When I asked what she was doing, she said, 'Looking for the edge.'" Clara felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. "She had that way of saying things," he added, voice quiet, "as if it meant everything and nothing. She sounds like a woman who wasn't seen for who she truly was." She was seen, just not understood. The fire cracked. Tristan's shoulders had sagged slightly, and Clara, without meaning to, reached out and placed her hand over his. Not out of pity, not to comfort, simply because she couldn't bear the distance between them anymore. His fingers stiffened, then slowly relaxed beneath hers. He turned his palm upward, cradling her hand for just a moment. Neither of them looked away. Her hand was warm, his was cool. But the contact was enough to say what neither dared speak aloud. When she withdrew, the loss of warmth was instant. "I should return," Clara said, standing. Tristan rose as well. He crossed to the fire and adjusted the logs, his movements slow and mechanical. "Lilibet has been calmer since you arrived." Clara looked at him. "She needs music, even when she doesn't play it. It calms her. She's not the only one." Their eyes met again. The tension between them had changed. It was no longer heavy with distrust. It hummed with something else. Possibility. As Clara stepped out into the corridor, she paused. Behind her, the piano remained silent. But in the hush of the hallway, she could still hear the notes. Not with her ears, but in her memory. She carried the melody with her, like something warm in the pocket of her coat. That night, she sat by her fire in a dressing gown of soft wool, hair loose around her shoulders, hands curled around a teacup. She wrote in her journal. He played a song no one else remembers. And for the first time since arriving at Greystone Hall, I felt less alone. He speaks in silences. But his grief is not empty. It is waiting, like mine. She set down the pen and closed the book. Then she leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting shut, the fire casting long shadows across the floor. Somewhere, faint and distant, she thought she heard it again. A single familiar note, played softly in the dark. Chapter 6. In the Garden of Glass. The sun arrived without warning. After days of grey drizzle and salted fog, it rose over the sea in a pale burst of gold, spilling across the cliffs and turning the water silver. Light streamed through Greystone Hall's high eastern windows, painting the corridors in soft yellows and pale blue shadows. Clara stood by the schoolroom window, hands wrapped around a teacup gone lukewarm. Her breath fogged the glass faintly. Below, the east garden glittered, frost catching in every thorn and blade of ivy. The angel by the fountain gleamed, her wings iced like stained glass. Behind her, the fire whispered low. Lilibet sat at her desk, not drawing, not writing, just watching Clara. The girl had been more withdrawn than usual that morning, her movements small and deliberate. She had refused toast, had not touched her milk, and had pulled her wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders like a cocoon. Clara turned from the window. "Would you like to go outside today?" Lilibet blinked. Then, softly, so softly Clara thought she'd imagined it, the girl said, "Yes." The word was small, careful, but it was there. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a locked door opening a fraction. "All right," she said gently. "Let's dress for the cold." They walked the garden path slowly. The stone was rimed with frost, and Clara's boots clicked lightly as they passed the hedgerows. She wore a charcoal wool cloak lined with fur and pale gloves buttoned at the wrist. Lilibet walked beside her in a dark green coat with pewter buttons and a matching bonnet tied under her chin. Her steps were light, almost noiseless, and she kept close without quite touching. "Are you warm enough?" Clara asked. Lilibet nodded. She looked smaller outside, dwarfed by the hedges and the stone angel that towered near the fountain. Her pale hair curled slightly under the bonnet, and her gloved hands remained folded. They walked without speaking for a while. The garden, though winter-stripped, had beauty in its bones, twisted rose bushes, dormant lavender, and a series of frost-covered laurel trees whose leaves glinted like glass in the sun. They passed a crumbling marble sundial. Then, as they neared a wrought-iron gate overgrown with dormant wisteria, Lilibet whispered, "She used to sing here." Clara turned. "Your mother?" she asked. Lilibet nodded. "In the greenhouse, when the glass was still clear." The words caught Clara off guard. It was only the second time Lilibet had spoken aloud since her arrival, and it came without prompting, like something that had simply floated up from memory. The greenhouse loomed at the far end of the path, its frame still elegant, though time and weather had dulled the panes. They entered slowly. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a once beautiful space now overgrown and heavy with quiet. Inside, the air was warmer, damp with decay, but not unpleasant. Clara brushed a hand over a pot of wild mint. In the far corner stood a lemon tree, still clinging to one bruised yellow fruit. "She made tea with the peel," Lilibet said, touching one of the curling leaves. "She cut stars from it." Clara crouched beside her. "She must have loved you very much." The girl didn't answer, but her eyes shone in the filtered light. "She sang," Lilibet said, "even when no one listened." Clara's throat tightened. There was something deeply unfair about the girl's quiet grief. Something noble, too. As if even in her mourning, Lilibet had learned to protect the memory of someone who had vanished too soon. "She sang one song more than the others," Lilibet added. "The sad one. The one Papa hates." "The one you played for me?" Clara asked. Lilibet nodded. Clara rose slowly. Her hand grazed a bench, and dust clouded into the air. "You miss her," she said. The girl said nothing, but she reached out and for the first time took Clara's hand. They returned to the house just before noon. Sir Tristan met them at the threshold to the main hall. He was dressed in black riding boots, a deep brown overcoat with velvet lapels, and a moss-green scarf that made the crystalline blue of his eyes appear even colder. His gaze landed on Lilibet first. "You've been outside?" he asked, his voice even, but edged with caution. "She asked to go," Clara said calmly. "We ended up in the garden." Lilibet stood beside her, silent but steady, her hands tucked into the folds of her coat. The wind had brought colour to her cheeks, and though she said nothing, her posture held something new. Quiet assurance, perhaps. Tristan looked at her a moment longer. Then, not unkindly, Go to the schoolroom. Cook will bring your lunch there. Lilibet nodded and walked away without a word. They waited in silence until her footsteps had faded down the corridor. Then Clara said softly, "She spoke. Twice." Tristan's eyes returned to her. What did she say? She remembered her mother. He didn't react at first, but something in his face, just at the edge of his mouth, the set of his jaw, fractured. Not much, just enough. He turned slightly, his gaze following where Lilibet had gone. Then, with quiet honesty, "I'm not sure I'm ready to hear her speak of Eleanor." "She's already speaking," Clara said gently. "Whether you're ready or not." He looked at her, expression unreadable. "Is she happy with you?" "I don't know, but she's trusting me." "That's more than I managed," he said quietly. Luncheon was solitary. Clara dined alone in the small east breakfast room, a firelit space with tall windows and faded floral wallpaper. A silver tray had been left for her, roasted trout with lemon, warm barley salad, and a slice of apple tart dusted in sugar. She ate slowly, savouring the quiet. But even as she lifted her fork, she felt a change in the house, an energy in the walls, the sense of something, or someone, approaching. It arrived in the form of a letter, neatly folded, placed beside her tea. "Miss Redwynd, you are invited to tea at 3 in the East Parlour. A visitor has arrived, a friend of the family. Please wear something suitable. Sir Tristan Ashley." Clara read it twice. A friend. Something about the note unsettled her. It wasn't the tone, it was the formality. The word visitor felt like a cold draft under the door. She chose her clothing with care. A navy walking gown with mother-of-pearl buttons. A sapphire ribbon at the throat. Gloves the colour of pale smoke. Her hair she pinned in soft coils, secured with her mother's silver comb. She arrived at the East Parlour at precisely 3. Sir Tristan was already there, dressed in a charcoal coat, his posture elegant and slightly guarded. He rose when she entered. "Miss Redwynd." "You asked for me." He gestured toward the tea table, and then the door opened. Clara turned. The woman who entered was tall, striking, and polished in every detail. Her coat was soft rose wool, her boots high-heeled, her hat wide-brimmed with black feathers. She removed her gloves slowly, as though accustomed to being watched. "Clara, this is Miss Honoria Pembroke," Tristan said. "An old friend." "Miss Redwynd," Honoria said with a bright, cold smile. "I've heard so much about you." Tea was served, lavender scones, thin cucumber sandwiches, and Earl Grey steeped to perfection. Honoria took her cup with 2 sugars and no cream. She spoke of London, the opera, the salons, the scandalous rumours in the Gazette. Clara said little. She watched instead. Noticed how Honoria leaned too close to Tristan when she laughed. How she dropped phrases meant to wound, wrapped in honeyed tones. "So you've come from London as well, Miss Redwynd?" she asked sweetly. "I have." "Such a busy city. It has a way of unearthing things." Clara met her gaze. "And burying them just as quickly." Honoria's eyes glittered. "Still, I imagine the quiet here must be a relief." "It is," Clara said, "though the quiet in this house is unusual." "Unusual?" Honoria turned to Tristan. "She's charming." Tristan did not smile, but neither did he correct her. After tea, Clara retreated to the library under the pretence of cataloguing books for Lilibet's next lessons. Tristan found her there an hour later. "She unsettled you," he said, watching her from the threshold. Clara didn't turn. "She has a way of shifting the air," Clara said. "One forgets how still it was until she's gone." "She was Eleanor's closest friend." "Was she yours?" A pause. "No." Clara looked at him now. Then why is she here? He stepped into the room, shutting the door behind him. She comes to remind me of what I was. And what were you? He moved closer. You wouldn't have liked me then. I'm not sure I like you now. That made him laugh, low, unexpected. But then the silence returned, thick as velvet. You're protective of Lilibet, Clara said, but you've been careless with everyone else. I've been grieving. So has she. Their eyes locked, the space between them pulsed. Tristan stepped back first. That night, Clara brought Lilibet her supper in the nursery herself. The child sat curled in her chair by the hearth, a wool shawl wrapped around her narrow shoulders, her stockinged feet tucked beneath her. Clara set the tray gently on the table. A small bowl of mutton broth, a slice of soft white bread, and a spoonful of stewed plums in a silver dish. The firelight caught the rim of the china, casting faint glimmers on the table. It's still warm, Clara said softly. Cook sent extra pepper in the broth, for your cold. Lilibet said nothing, but her gaze lingered on the tray. Then, slowly, she reached for the bread. Clara didn't take a seat. She crouched beside the girl's chair, folding her hands over her knees. I wanted to thank you, she said quietly. For earlier. For trusting me with your voice. Lilibet's eyes didn't lift, but the way her hand stilled on the edge of the dish told Clara she was listening. I wasn't sure if you ever would, not to me. The girl didn't speak, but after a moment she shifted, just slightly, and let her hand brush against Clara's. Not quite a touch, but not an accident. Clara smiled, faint and true. She stayed there beside her while the fire settled and the child quietly began to eat. Chapter 7. Ashes and Embers. The storm came back the way grief does, not all at once, but in stages. First, the wind, low and constant, like breath against the stone. Then the sea, rising again, angry and insistent. Finally, the rain, a cold, slanting thing that lashed at the windows and turned the world outside to water and shadow. Clara watched it from her bedroom window, her hand resting lightly against the sill. The house had been quieter than usual all day. Not peaceful, never peaceful, just watchful. The kind of quiet that holds its breath. By mid-morning, she had noticed small things out of place. A book missing from the schoolroom shelf. A scarf, once folded neatly on the end of her bed, now trailing across the floor. The doll Lilibet clutched nightly was not in its cradle by the hearth, but left on the windowsill, its glass eyes staring into the fog. They were not the kind of things a child did, not carelessly, and certainly not Lilibet. The girl had been subdued all day, her eyes heavy-lidded and dark. When asked if something was wrong, she'd only drawn a single word on her slate. Listening. Clara tried not to let it follow her, but by the time dusk fell, she was carrying it like a second spine. The fire had gone out, mist clung to the panes. Her plum-wool gown felt heavier than it should, as if the silence had settled into the fabric itself. She was supposed to join Honoria Pembroke and Tristan for tea in the library. She had considered sending a polite refusal. Instead, she lingered too long at her writing desk, fingers trembling slightly as she penned a journal entry she did not finish. The house watches. The house waits. But what exactly does it want? By the time she arrived at the library, the lamps were lit. Rain pounded the tall windows, and the hearth roared. A fire of orange and gold flickered against the spines of leather-bound books. Honoria Pembroke sat near it, poised in rose velvet, a half-drained glass of Madeira in hand. Her dark hair gleamed in the firelight. Her boots, perfectly polished, were crossed at the ankle. Tristan stood by the mantel, one hand resting on the carved stone, his expression unreadable. "Miss Redwynd," Honoria said, smiling too widely, "we thought you'd forgotten us." I had not. Clara moved toward the low table where tea had been set, but the air in the room had shifted. There was tension. Delicate, razor-thin. "Honoria was just telling me," Tristan said slowly, "about her recent visit to London." Clara met his eyes. He was warning her. Honoria sipped her wine. So many interesting names floating around these days. So many little scandals. Her gaze slid to Clara. One forgets how small the city is. Clara remained still. Indeed. Particularly among the education set, Honoria continued. A few names always reappear. Women with curious pasts, governesses who leave no references, or whose references disappear. Tristan's brow furrowed. Honoria. "Oh, come now," she said lightly. "I'm simply noting patterns." Clara set her teacup down too carefully. "Are you suggesting something, Miss Pembroke?" "I'm suggesting," Honoria said, rising to her feet, "that grief invites strangers into one's home, and not all of them are what they appear to be." "Enough," Tristan said sharply. But Clara didn't flinch. Her voice, when it came, was level. "You think you're protecting him. You're not. You're protecting a ghost." Honoria's smile faded. "And what are you protecting, Miss Redwynd?" Clara didn't answer, because the truth was, she wasn't sure. She left before dinner. The hallway was colder than it should have been. Her boots echoed as she climbed the main staircase, but the moment she reached the landing, she stopped. Something was wrong. The smell, smoke. Not from the hearth, not from the kitchen, from upstairs. From the west corridor. From her room. She ran. The door was ajar. Smoke curled from beneath it in grey ribbons. She burst inside. The curtains were alight. The writing desk had caught. The fire was creeping along the floorboards, licking up the legs of the chair like fingers. Clara didn't think. She simply acted. She tore down the drapes, beat at the flames with her cloak, grabbed the water jug from the wash basin and hurled it at the fire. The flames hissed as the water struck them, and the door behind her slammed, hard. She spun around. The handle wouldn't turn. It was locked, from the outside. "Hello?" Her voice echoed against the stone. Nothing. Smoke still clung to the air. Her eyes stung. By the time Tristan arrived, drawn by the smell and the sound, Clara was on her knees by the hearth, coughing, one hand wrapped in her wet cloak. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. Her face was smudged with ash, her lips pale. He pulled her up gently, hands on her shoulders. "Clara." He looked around the wrecked room. Scorched floorboards, blackened hearth, her trunk overturned and soaked through. His expression darkened, his mouth a thin, silent line. Clara sat still, her hands wrapped in the edge of her damp cloak. "It wasn't an accident," she said quietly. His voice came low. "You're certain?" She nodded once. "The window was open, the rug soaked in lamp oil, and my journal is gone." A silence passed between them, deeper than shock, sharper than fear. He exhaled through his nose, fists clenched. "Someone wanted to frighten you." "Or worse," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He moved closer, slowly, as though approaching something breakable. "You should have called for help." "I didn't think," she murmured. "I just acted." "You could have died." The words came out flat, but his eyes gave him away. She looked up at him then, her voice uneven. "You still don't know who I am." Tristan looked at her, voice low. No one would blame you for leaving. Clara met his gaze. I considered it. The fire crackled softly behind them. She added almost to herself. But there's something about this place, about her. I couldn't leave. He stepped closer. You should. This house, it devours the well-meaning. Clara's voice steadied. Then perhaps I'm not well-meaning. His brow lifted, but he didn't argue. He only studied her, truly studied her, as though seeing something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. You're something else entirely, he said. Clara let out a breath. I stayed, because she needs someone who sees her. Her voice faltered. And because I didn't want to run again. He looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, I see you too. Their eyes met. She whispered, I know I shouldn't have stayed. This house, your house, it's heavy with memory, and I've been running from mine. So have I, he said. The storm pressed against the windows. Then he reached for her. The kiss wasn't elegant. It wasn't practiced, but it was real. His hands tangled in her hair. Her fingers clutched the folds of his coat. The world tipped, sea and fire, grief and ghosts, and for a breathless moment, there was only heat. When they pulled apart, they didn't speak. Clara touched his chest, fingers trembling. This won't protect me. He didn't step away. No, he said, but I will. That night, Clara was moved to a different room. A modest chamber tucked just down the corridor from the nursery, with low ceilings and ivy-laced windows that overlooked the orchard. The walls were papered in a faded ivory damask. The furniture was older, simpler. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a writing desk with a chipped corner, a wardrobe that creaked faintly when opened. A single candle had been lit on the mantel, its flame shivering in the draught. Clara stepped inside, still smelling of soot and smoke and rosewater. Mrs. Hodge said nothing as she handed her a fresh towel and a woolen wrap. No commentary, no questions. Only the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had seen worse and understood that comfort sometimes arrived in silence. Clara closed the door softly behind her. She did not unpack. Instead, she stood at the window and listened to the wind moving through the laurel trees. The sea beyond was restless again, louder now, nearer. The kind of sound that seemed to echo through bones rather than air. Downstairs, Tristan ordered 2 servants to clean the scorched remains of her former room. The rug was ruined, the curtains singed to ash. A crack had formed in the windowsill from the sudden heat. But no one was injured. That was the phrase passed in hushed tones through the halls that night. No one was injured. But something had been revealed. Something beyond the fire. The next morning, a letter was sent by footman to the guest chamber at the far end of the west wing. It bore no address, no pleasantries, only 4 lines. Honoria. You've made your intentions clear. I've made mine. The carriage will be ready at 10. TA. She left within the hour. No goodbye, no farewell to Lilibet, no final barb for Clara. Only a single pink glove, left curled like a wilted flower on the stair railing, silk creased at the knuckle, deliberately forgotten. She found her journal stuffed into the bottom drawer of the library desk, half buried beneath ledgers and dried ink pots. Someone had hidden it, not taken it. It was wedged deep, pages bent, the ribbon marker torn, several sheets near the centre missing entirely. She turned the pages slowly, her fingertips trailing the familiar ink. Whoever had taken it hadn't torn out as much as she'd feared, just enough to hurt. Most of her writing remained intact. Quiet entries, observations, snatches of music, little poems written in the margins when she couldn't sleep. But the pages that were gone were the ones that mattered, the ones that told the truth. The ones that said where she came from. What she'd done. What she feared. She sat at the desk as the light began to fade, the lamps still unlit. Lilibet was already asleep in the nursery, curled under her quilt with the doll cradled beside her, and the slate wiped clean. A fire flickered low in the grate. Clara dipped her pen in ink and wrote carefully, deliberately, like a woman laying bricks in a new wall. The fire was meant to destroy, but it cleared the air instead. He kissed me. Not to possess, but to prove I'm still here. The house is still watching. But I am watching back. She closed the journal, laid the pen aside, and sat still for a long time in the hush that followed. The wind scraped against the windows. The sea answered. The walls listened. And somewhere in the distance, too faint to be certain, a single piano note, low, lingering. Chapter 8. Truths Unravelled. The wind rose before dawn. Clara had not slept. She sat near the hearth, shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the journal open before her but untouched. The pen sat idle. A thin strip of ash from the candle curled upward, floating like smoke from a pyre. She could still smell it. Not just the fire from 2 nights past, but all the fires she'd fled. The smoke of public shame, the heat of whispered names, the slow burn of her reputation, reduced to ruin. She pressed her hand over the blank page, as if to quiet it. The memory. The ache. Outside, the cliffs groaned beneath the sea. Inside, the house held its breath. By the time the sun began to rise, pale and unwilling, Clara had already dressed. Not in mourning grey today. Today, she wore a gown of bottle green with jet buttons down the front, the kind of dress that once might have belonged to a woman who expected to be seen. She twisted her hair up into a tight knot and pinned it without a strand out of place. Her only jewellery was her mother's silver comb. She looked in the mirror, half expecting to find the girl she'd been before London, before the scandal, before everything. But that girl was gone. In her place stood Clara. Changed, yes, but not ruined, not broken, still standing, still herself. She found him in the library. Of course it was the library, the house's heart, the place where truths lived, or were buried. The fire was already lit. Tristan stood by the window, his coat unfastened, his shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm. He looked like someone who had woken from a long night and not yet decided if he was grateful to be awake. He did not turn when she entered. "You came," he said. "I needed to." She crossed the room without hesitation and took the chair opposite the fire. The silence between them was not awkward. It was purposeful, dense with everything unsaid. He moved only to pour 2 cups of dark tea from the silver pot on the sideboard. No sugar, no cream. Just the bitter truth. He handed her one. She did not drink. "You said you wanted to know," she said quietly. "I still do. Even if it changes things?" He met her gaze. "Things have already changed." She breathed in once, deep and steady. The fire had burned low by the time she spoke again. Clara sat still, her hands folded in her lap, as though holding something fragile. The fire's glow limned her face in amber and shadow. She didn't look at Tristan as she began. Tristan watched her closely. "My father was a solicitor, quiet, fair, dead before I turned 18. My mother died earlier than that. It was just me and Cecily." She hesitated. "My younger sister." Tristan's voice was low. "The one who married poorly." Clara gave a single nod. She was only 19, and he was dazzling. Everyone said so. He smiled at the right moments, knew the right verses, told the kind of stories that made you feel clever just for laughing. Her tone shifted, sharpened. But it was all a mask. Tristan watched her closely. He didn't want a wife, he wanted property. He isolated her, no visitors, no letters. She had to ask him for money, to buy pins, to buy underthings. He controlled what she wore, what she ate, when she spoke. She stared into the fire. And when she disobeyed him, he struck her, not with rage, but with precision. A hand across the face, a bruise where no one would see. And always after the apology. The softness, the story of how she had brought it on herself. Tristan's mouth tightened. He told her she was hysterical, that no one else would have her, that even I, her own sister, despised her, that I wouldn't come if she called. Her voice dropped. And then she stopped calling. A long silence. The fire cracked. The last time I saw her before I intervened, Clara said, she had bruises on her ribs. She moved like something broken. And when I asked, she smiled, said she'd slipped on the stairs. She shook her head once. But I saw the shape of the boot print. Tristan drew a slow breath. Clara went on. He made her feel invisible, and he did it with just enough charm, just enough plausibility, that no one questioned him. Not the neighbours, not the servants, not the church. So I made a plan. Her hands twisted together in her lap. I waited until he was away, gone for a hunting weekend. I packed what she could carry. I hired a carriage, sent her to a cousin of my father's in Bath. A widow with money and no love for men. And you? I stayed, and I made sure people knew she was gone. Tristan frowned. You admitted it? I said I'd helped her leave, that I'd interfered, that I'd encouraged her to abandon her marriage. I wanted them to look at me, not her. I needed him to believe I'd tricked her away. His brow furrowed. Didn't that cost you everything? Yes. She met his eyes, but it gave her her life back. He didn't speak. Clara gave a thin smile. He let the story stand, probably because it let him play the victim, the jilted husband, the wronged gentleman. And I was convenient to blame, a meddlesome spinster sister. And the scandal. Swift, brutal. Her voice dropped. I lost the post I held, every friend I had. I left London under my mother's name and never looked back. A long moment passed. You didn't deserve that, Tristan said finally. He deserved worse, Clara said. But he'll never get it. Men like that rarely do. He looked at her. And your sister? She's free now, married again, to a man who treats her kindly. They have a son. A pause. Her first husband died in a riding accident 2 years ago. Tristan raised an eyebrow. Clara's mouth curved. Fitting, really. He always thought he was invincible. And he never tried to find her? No. Her voice cooled. There was no money in it. Cecily had no dowry left, no inheritance to claim. Once she was gone, she wasn't useful to him anymore. And his pride wouldn't let him be seen chasing a wife who'd run. I understand you. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I don't regret what I did, she said quietly. Only that I had to. Their eyes held. And for the first time, the truth didn't feel like a wound between them, but a bridge. His expression stayed the same. But something in him had shifted. When he spoke, his voice was lower. My wife didn't love me. Clara said nothing. She never said it. But she didn't have to. She was distant. Always. Even when she smiled. Even in bed. I thought she would come to love me. In time. But she never did. He stared into the fire like a man seeing a memory in the flames. She loved someone else. A composer. Long dead. Romantic, wasn't it? She'd play his music when she thought I wasn't listening. Clara shifted slightly forward. "You're not angry?" "I was," he admitted, "but mostly I was tired. Tired of waiting to be chosen." He exhaled sharply. "We had Lilibet, and for a time, things were easier. Not better, but quieter." "And then?" "She walked to the edge of the cliffs one night and never came back." Clara closed her eyes. "I didn't know she'd gone," he added. "I was playing the piano. One of the pieces she used to love. When I stopped, the house was too quiet." Clara set the cup down and stood. She crossed to him slowly. "You blamed yourself." He didn't answer. "You think if you had said something, or loved her differently, or walked with her that night?" "Yes," he said. "Exactly." She stood before him now. "I understand that kind of guilt." He looked at her fully, eyes unreadable. "You think I would judge you," he said. "Wouldn't you?" "No," he said simply, "because I know what it is to be both innocent and responsible, and to live with both." She touched his wrist. Light. Careful. "I've spent years pretending to be someone I'm not. Someone safe, polished, quiet. But I'm not." "No," he said. "You're not quiet. Not when you write. Not when you look at Lilibet like she's the only thing that matters." His hand covered hers. "I've spent years building walls," he said. "And you walked through them like they weren't there." They didn't kiss. Not yet. They stood still, firelight flickering between them, hands joined, grief and guilt woven between their fingers like old thread. It was more intimate than touch. It was permission. Later, Clara returned to her room. The fire was still burning. The window was cracked, letting in the sound of the sea. She removed her gown slowly, folded it with care, and slipped into a cotton shift. She lit a single candle and opened her journal. She wrote, "He knows now. Not just what happened, but what it cost. He told me the sea took her. But it was loneliness, grief, the weight of being unheard. He loved her with distance, with silence. And she died, still waiting to be seen. I loved my sister imperfectly, fiercely, clumsily. But I didn't turn away. And she lived because of that. We are both still haunted. But not by what we did, by what we couldn't change. Maybe now the house will let us breathe." She closed the journal. From somewhere down the corridor came a sound, soft, distant, like footsteps on stone. She rose and opened the door. The hall was still, empty. But just outside her room, something lay on the floor. She bent and picked it up, a torn scrap of card, yellowed with age. The edge was scalloped, part of an old music program, the print just legible in the lamplight. A few notes were inked in the margin, circled in faint charcoal. Just 3. The same 3 Lilibet always played. Clara stared at it for a long moment, the air around her suddenly colder, though no wind stirred. Chapter 9. The Breaking Storm. The wind began to rise long before nightfall. At first it was no more than a whisper, dry leaves scratching across the stone terrace, a low hiss at the nursery windows. But by dusk, it had become a living thing. It howled down the chimneys and rattled at the shutters like a wild thing clawing to get in. The whole of Greystone Hall groaned under its weight. The weather wasn't the only thing Clara couldn't ignore. Lilibet had been quiet all day, but it was not the quiet of melancholy or distraction. It was the wary silence of someone listening for footsteps. She jumped at the sound of doors slamming. She kept glancing over her shoulder. Her hands trembled when she reached for her chalk. At one point, she asked softly, Will the maids still be awake tonight? Yes, Clara said gently. Why do you ask? But the child only shook her head. She wouldn't say more. At 7, the rain came, sudden and slanting. It struck the windows hard enough to rattle the panes. Downstairs, the shutters were closed and bolted. A footman lit extra candles in the upper corridors. Tristan came to the nursery just before supper, his coat damp, his face tight with concern. There's a gale warning, he said without preamble. I've doubled the watch at the grounds, ordered the shutters secured. Stay upstairs tonight. Clara met his gaze. Will you? His expression flickered. I'll try. They didn't speak about what lay beneath that promise. At 9 o'clock, Clara walked Lilibet to bed. The nursery fireplace glowed low and steady, but the corners of the room were thick with shadow. She brushed back the girl's pale hair, smoothing it away from her brow. I'll be just down the hall, she said gently. You're safe. Lilibet looked at her with wide, grey eyes. If someone came, she whispered, would you know? Clara paused. Yes, I'd know, and I'd stop them. Lilibet nodded once, and said nothing more. Clara didn't sleep. The storm clawed at the windows, wind howling like a beast denied. The sound seemed to bleed through the stones themselves. The fire in Clara's grate had gone low, but she sat wrapped in her shawl, listening. Something didn't feel right. She rose at midnight to check the nursery. The corridor was dim and flickering. The sconces were still lit, but one was guttering, half drowned in wax. Clara opened the nursery door. The bed was empty. At first, Clara thought the covers had simply been pushed aside in sleep, but they were neat, untouched. The window was shut, bolted. A chair had been moved. A blanket was missing. And on the floor, near the far side of the room, mud. A smear of it. Not a child's footprint. Too large. A boot print. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Lilibet, she called, louder now. No answer. She turned and ran. She found Tristan in the main hall speaking in low tones to the steward. She's gone, Clara said, breathless. His head snapped toward her. What? Lilibet. She's not in the nursery, but the window was closed. There's mud. On the floor. Not hers. Tristan didn't hesitate. He turned sharply to the steward. Rouse every servant. Search every room, every stair, the cellars, the attics. Clara's voice was steady now. I think she was taken. By who? I don't know, but someone who knows the house. Tristan's jaw clenched. Then we search. Clara nodded once. They moved through the house like shadows. The servants were quiet but alert, moving with lanterns and hushed voices. Clara and Tristan searched together. They moved through the drawing room, the old music room, the upper corridors where no one had walked in years. No child. Then Clara remembered something. There's a rear servant's stair from the linen closet, she said. It connects to the old storage cellars. Tristan turned without a word. Together, they descended into the lower halls. The cellars were cold and close, the air damp with stone and age. Cobwebs thickened toward the far wall, where a narrow wooden stair descended into a smaller space. They found Lilibet in the west wing. The hidden door behind the linen press had been left ajar. The narrow servants' stairwell led down into the old scullery, unused for years. There, in the cold dark, Lilibet sat on a folded blanket in the corner of the stone room. Her hands were bound, but her face was calm, her eyes steady. Clara ran to her, falling to her knees. Sweetheart. Lilibet didn't cry. She only whispered, I knew you'd come. Tristan cut the bindings with a blade from his pocket, lifting her gently into his arms. Clara wrapped the girl in her shawl, tucking it close. She said you'd gone, Lilibet murmured. She said no one was coming. Who? Tristan asked, already guessing. Lilibet hesitated. Mrs. Hodge. Back upstairs, servants moved swiftly as word spread. Tristan gave terse orders. The housekeeper was to be confined to her chambers, and the local magistrate summoned at once. He spoke without raising his voice, but no one questioned him. Clara stood with Lilibet in the nursery as the child was changed and warmed, her fingers like porcelain against the teacup they coaxed her to hold. One of the younger maids, Alice, lingered long enough to whisper that she'd seen Mrs. Hodge carry something heavy wrapped in a shawl earlier that evening. "I thought it was just firewood," she said, ashamed. Clara's heart burned, but she only nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. At last, Tristan said quietly, "I thought she was safe, and all the while it was happening right under my roof." "She trusted someone who didn't deserve it," Clara said. "So did you." He looked down the hall toward the darkened stairs. "And now she'll carry that." Clara's voice softened. "Maybe, but not alone." But he didn't reach for her, not yet. There would be time. Chapter 10. Beneath the Laurel Tree. The morning after the storm broke, Greystone Hall stood still. The wind had finally died. Rain gutters dripped in silence. The halls smelled of damp stone, charred wood, and something else, fresh air. For the first time in months, the weight that had pressed down on the house had shifted. Clara rose before the bells. She dressed in the pale lavender wool gown Lilibet had once said made her look like a spring crocus, and moved quietly through the corridors. She passed the nursery door, then hesitated. Inside, Lilibet slept curled in a tight comma beneath a quilt stitched with faded violets. A small scrap of hair clung to her forehead. The doll Clara had mended for her lay beside her, one arm outstretched. Tristan stood at the far end of the corridor, as though he'd been keeping watch. "She didn't wake once," he said softly. Clara nodded. "She knows she's safe." He looked at her with something deeper than gratitude, but he didn't speak it. It hovered between them, waiting. Downstairs, the household stirred. Servants moved with unusual quiet, no clatter, no gossip. Even the footman glanced warily toward the main staircase, as though expecting some ghost of the storm to descend it. It was Bess, the youngest maid, sharp-eyed and nervous, who found it first. She had been cleaning the stove room when the floorboard caught her toe. She cursed, bent down, and found it loose. Beneath it, a folded paper. Creased. Smudged. Still faintly scented with lavender oil and coal dust. She stared at it, read it, and ran. Clara and Tristan were seated in the small study when Bess burst in, cheeks flushed, curls escaping her cap. "Begging your pardon, sir, miss, but I think you'll want to see this." She held the paper out with trembling fingers. Tristan unfolded it slowly. Clara leaned closer. The letter was brief, written in an elegant, unmistakable hand. To Mrs. Hodge. "Miss Redwynd is not to remain in the child's good graces. I trust you to correct this before the month's end. Do what is necessary. You'll be compensated, as agreed. Do not write again. Burn this." The bottom bore only a small embossed crest, a lion rampant, half faded with ash. Tristan read it twice, then lowered the page, his face unreadable. Bess shifted nervously. "I didn't know who to bring it to, but I knew it wasn't right." "You did the right thing," Clara said gently. Tristan's jaw clenched. "Where is Mrs. Hodge now?" he asked. "In her chambers, sir. Under watch, as you ordered." He nodded once. "She won't be staying the night. I'll see she's escorted off the grounds before luncheon, and the magistrate will be informed." They found Mrs. Hodge in her chambers, seated stiffly in a high-backed chair, hands folded in her lap as if she'd been expecting them. She didn't rise when Tristan entered, nor when Clara stepped in beside him. He closed the door quietly behind them. "We found the letter," he said. Her expression didn't flicker. "I assumed you would." "You betrayed this household," Tristan said, his voice low. "You lied to me. You terrified my daughter. You targeted Miss Redwynd, and you did it all under my roof." He stepped closer, each word deliberate. "You were meant to protect my child, not use her." Mrs. Hodge folded her hands. "I did what I had to. I've served this house for 20 years, and what thanks have I had? She," a flick of her eyes toward Clara, "walks in, barely dry from the road, and suddenly I'm nothing." Clara stepped forward. "You took my journal, set fire to my room, had a child stolen from her bed." "I followed orders." Mrs. Hodge's voice sharpened. "Lady Honoria made it quite clear what would happen if I helped ease you out. There was to be compensation, enough to leave service altogether." Tristan's voice went cold. "And you thought that was worth terrifying a child?" "It was just noise and shadows at first, a few missing things. She was supposed to quit." "She didn't," Clara said, "and your games turned dangerous." "A woman nearly died," Tristan added. His voice remained low, controlled. "Because of you." "I never laid a hand on her." "No," Clara said, "but you lit the match." A long silence. Mrs. Hodge's mouth tightened. "It was never meant to go that far." "But you stayed." Tristan stepped closer. "You're finished here. I'll see you escorted from the grounds, and the magistrate will know everything." Mrs. Hodge rose with deliberate poise, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeve. "This house was once governed by order, decorum, tradition." Her gaze flicked to Clara. "Now it bends to softness, sentiment." Tristan's voice was cool. "It bends to what is right." "No, sir," she said, a hint of steel beneath the civility. "It falters. Since her arrival, it has strayed." "She hasn't strayed," he replied. "She's restored what was nearly lost." He stepped to the door and opened it. "You will leave now, not tomorrow." Mrs. Hodge lifted her chin. "And if I do not?" He met her stare evenly. "Then I shall see you out myself." Something in her expression shifted. Not fear, but recognition. She had lost. She turned her head slightly toward Clara. "You may dress it in gentility, Miss Redwynd, but chaos always comes when you forget your place." Clara didn't waver. "And what place is that?" "Not here." Clara's voice was quiet, resolute. "No, this is exactly where I'm meant to be." Without another word, Mrs. Hodge gathered her skirts and walked out. Tristan followed, and this time, he didn't look back. They walked the length of the corridor in silence, his footsteps firm behind hers. Down the great staircase. Across the entry hall, where servants had quietly gathered behind doors. At the threshold, she paused. He did not. He opened the door, held it wide. Mrs. Hodge stepped through, jaw tight, eyes dry. Tristan followed her out. Later that afternoon, a discreet message arrived by post. Lady Honoria had departed London for the continent, indefinitely. No forwarding address was provided, no farewell, no apology. Only absence. That evening, Tristan sat alone in the library, a folded sheet of cream paper in his hand. It bore no name, no signature, only a list of expenses. And at the bottom, a sum, enough to silence a servant, or buy loyalty from the wrong one. Clara entered quietly. He looked up. It was her. She said nothing, only waited. He held up the paper. Found this tucked in a drawer in her chamber. Hodge was being paid, regularly, enough to keep her obedient. Clara stepped closer. To do what? His jaw tightened. Drive you out. Keep Lilibet quiet. Maintain control. He looked away. Honoria always liked tidy things, obedient things. Clara's expression darkened. And you? He nodded once. It wasn't love. I think she liked the sorrow more than the man. It made me quieter, easier to manage. Clara looked at the paper again, now curled slightly in his hand. Do you think she ever cared for Lilibet? Tristan's voice was quiet. No, she saw her as a loose end, a memory too sharp to polish. He stood and crossed to the hearth. Without ceremony, he fed the note to the fire. They watched together as it blackened, curled, and vanished. A long silence passed between them. Then Clara said quietly, I'm glad she's gone. So am I. He looked out the window, then back at her. She thought I would forget her, he murmured. Eleanor. You didn't, Clara said. I tried, but only to survive. What I forgot was how to hope. She studied his face. Is that what this is? She asked gently. Hope? He didn't answer right away. Then, no, it's a choice. Their hands brushed. You once told me I didn't know who you were, he said. A small smile curved her mouth. And you said I was something else entirely. I still believe that. He took her hand. Stay. She looked down at their joined fingers. Her voice was quiet, but sure. My heart decided long before you asked. Later that night, Clara sat by the fire, her journal open across her lap. The tea had long gone cold. Her shawl had slipped from one shoulder. A single candle flickered beside her, its light catching the ink. She wrote, The house no longer waits. It no longer watches. It breathes again. There are shadows still, but they belong to memory, not fear. Lilibet sleeps without tears. I sleep without listening for footsteps. The portrait is gone. The piano is no longer silent. The ghosts have gone quiet. She paused, then added, I am not running. I am not alone. She closed the book. From somewhere down the hall, the pianoforte began to play. The notes were soft, careful, a little uncertain. The melody was hesitant, but it sounded like a beginning. Epilogue. A new spring. The snowdrops bloomed first. They arrived shyly, as if still uncertain of their welcome. Tiny white bells pushing up through the thawing earth near the eastern hedgerow, their petals like lace against the soil. Then came the crocuses, defiant in violet and gold, followed by daffodils that opened their yellow mouths to the wind and sang of light. Greystone Hall had weathered another winter. But this one had passed differently. Not with dread, not with silence, with expectancy. It was spring. And the house no longer watched like a judge. It breathed. It listened. It lived. Lilibet ran laughing through the garden, her hair loose behind her, her boots streaked with soil and petal stains. A trail of pale pink ribbons marked her path. Her doll had long since lost them, but she insisted on tying them to the garden gate, to the handles of the wheelbarrow, to the laurel tree at the far end of the lawn. She says the house needs reminders, Clara had explained once, that it's allowed to be happy. She watched her now from the terrace, sunlight pooling at her feet, her hands ink-smudged from writing. Her journal lay open beside a dish of sugared lemon slices, the same journal that had once held words like loss and fear and ghosts. Today's entry began simply. The air smells of earth and honey. The rooms stay warm without fire. And I woke to Tristan reading poetry beside me. She paused and smiled. Inside the open drawing room doors, her husband's voice carried through, low and steady, reading from a slim, leather-bound volume. I have found the quiet at last, he read. Not in the world's absence, but in its presence beside yours. He glanced up, caught her watching, and smiled. She crossed the flagstones and sat beside him, folding her legs beneath her and resting her head briefly against his shoulder. I thought you disliked poetry, she said. I used to, he replied, brushing a kiss into her hair. But then I met a woman who made the world sound like verse. Clara rolled her eyes, laughing. That's appallingly sentimental. And entirely sincere, he replied. She reached for the book, turning a page. Her hand brushed his. No ghosts stirred. No cold draught swept through the room, just birdsong, and the scent of roses beginning to bloom. They walked the grounds later, Lilibet chasing a butterfly near the orchard, while Clara and Tristan followed at a slower pace. The old laurel tree stood in full leaf, its branches casting soft, dappled shade. At its base, a bench. On it, a small brass plaque. Eleanor Ashley, resting in light and peace. Clara sat, lacing her fingers with Tristan's. I used to think this place would never forgive me, he said, for the silence, for the sorrow. It doesn't hold on to sorrow, Clara replied. Not anymore. Neither do we. He looked toward the girl running down the path, arms flung wide, hair glinting gold. She doesn't hide anymore. No, Clara said. None of us do. A breeze passed through the trees. The house stood in the distance, no longer a monument to sorrow, but a home. Windows flung open, doors that stayed unlocked, music drifting now and then from the upstairs hall. They'd married quietly in town a few days before, but it was here, beneath the laurel tree, that they said the words that mattered, vows spoken not before witnesses, but before wind and leaf and light. Lilibet took her role very seriously, scattering petals with care and declaring herself both flower girl and guardian of the rings. Clara had smiled at that, and Tristan had bowed gravely to his officiant. They exchanged vows and rings, and kissed to the sound of birdsong and wind in the branches. No guests, no fanfare, only love, only them. At the top of the west tower, a small room had been made, Clara's space. Not for storage or solitude, but for writing, for light. She had taken root here, and grown. As dusk softened the edges of the sky, they returned to the house. The lamps glowed amber. The fire in the drawing room crackled with comfort, not necessity. Lilibet curled into Clara's side with a blanket and a book. Later, after the girl had gone to bed, Tristan leaned against the doorway of the music room and watched as Clara lit the final candle on the mantel. You'll write again, he said. She nodded, slowly. Not because I have to, but because I want to. And what will you write about? She smiled. Home? She crossed to him, slid her arms around his waist, and whispered the last words of the evening. I'm not afraid anymore. The end. Thanks for spending part of your day with this story. New tales drop every Tuesday, or on Sundays if you're one of the clever few who've tapped the join button. It costs less than a bonnet ribbon and comes with far fewer strings attached. If you'd like to buy me a cup of tea, you can tap that thanks button right below. It's far less scandalous than slipping coins into a reticule. I'll be back soon with another story, unless I've floated off into the clouds like this little bell.